Let me ask you firstly, did you agree with the notion of a referendum in the first place?
Yes, I felt that it was essentially a sign that after many years the mood of the public had filtered through to government, and therefore it was a successful exercise in democracy that a referendum should be called.
Didn't you think this was David Cameron just trying to save his own skin, though?
Yes, but that's the way democratic pressure is exerted upon politicians. That it was the resignations of two Conservative MPs who then fought by-elections and held their seats as UKIP candidates, which made him realise that the mood of his own party on this issue was against him.
So how do you think it was handled?
The campaign was not a very effective debate, and that the Leave campaign quite naturally was focusing upon the question of accountable government and the constitutional aspect of the question, and that is the heart of the whole matter, in my view, that the European Union has created a disconnect between government and governed, that, to put it very simply, most people do not want to be governed by politicians they don't know through procedures that they don't understand. The Remain side never wanted to address constitutional questions, let alone put forward a positive case for European integration, but focused almost entirely upon the economic arguments and the view that leaving the European Union will be disruptive to business. So, in a sense, they were making quite separate cases which didn't really interact with each other very effectively. There was a constitutional political story from the Leave campaign, an economic story from the Remain campaign, and not very much scope for real discussion between them.
How many people would know their own MP?
I think a good many more than know who their MEPs are. And in any case, MEPs are not really significant figures, and that the European Parliament is not a real parliament. It's an assembly. It's not a parliament in the sense that it, elects an executive. It's not a parliament that can even reverse its own decisions unless it's given the opportunity by the Commission.
So when it came to the vote, may I ask what you voted?
I would have hoped that was already evident from my answers, but I voted Leave.
And the reasons for voting Leave are constitutional?
They are to preserve our political culture, to preserve a system of accountable government where it's possible to identify who is responsible for a decision and possible to remove that person from power if you disagree with their decision. In the EU, neither of those things is really possible, that so much of the real decision-making goes on behind closed doors, by people we've never heard of. You might say, oh well, you can look at the EU website and it's full of documents telling you about the meetings. Yes, but the real business is, certainly with the Council of Ministers, is done in secret, even though they claim it meets an open session. In the open sessions there are just formulaic statements of policy, then they go behind closed doors for consultations, then at the end they just announce what's been decided. Also, I think, certainly when you look at the website, the way that the public is distanced from decision making is simply by tedium. Documents of the most extremely boring, bureaucratic, legalistic nature, and you would have to be very keen to wade through those. Well, our journalists don't even wade through them. That's another problem why I think government by EU institutions seems undemocratic. That it's simply not adequately covered by the media because they think it's too boring.
Well, you're saying it is too boring.
Yes, I think it's a way that that EU politics, EU governance is insulating itself from public opinion.
Sure. So they would say, although it's transparent in the sense that it's all out there, but it would take a superhuman person to wade through it all and put it all into context, and it's an ongoing
I'm
project
sure it's
anyway.
Not all out there, but a great deal of
Right.
it is. But yes, it would take a huge amount of effort. You might say, well, most people don't follow British politics that closely, and it's true that our parliamentary coverage in the media is not good these days. However, they do feel some identification with it, even if they aren't quite sure who their Member of Parliament is. They will know who some Members of Parliament are, and they will... And, I mean, they don't have huge respect for MPs, but even if they think they are fools and villains, they at least feel that they are our fools and villains, and there is some sense of identification. Because I mean, the essence of a governing system is the way it can command legitimacy in the eyes of the people who are governed by it. And somehow, over centuries, you have built up the idea that what, at present, 650 people sitting in a chamber in Westminster, what they decide is somehow important and we should follow it. I don't think British people are really conscious, don't feel any pressure to respect the legitimacy of what 28 national government representatives meeting in the Council of Ministers and 700 odd members of the European Parliament, let alone 28 commissioners, are deciding. They don't really identify with it or think that those are people they know or people who know them.
Mm. So when it came to the vote, when it came to the day after, were you surprised at the result?
No, I fully expected Leave to win.
Were you surprised at the reaction of the MPs involved, for instance Boris Johnson?
I was very disappointed in his reaction. Not that I had a terribly high opinion of him already, but I felt that from the morning after, when Nigel Farage was typically triumphalist, forgivably in the circumstances, having just won what seemed to be a triumph, Boris Johnson looked frightened. I think his credibility was never recovered.
Now, this happened 2 years ago. Approximately.
Almost three.
Almost three. What's your overarching view of the last 3 years? Do you think, what is your opinion of what's been accomplished in the last 3 years, leading up to this point?
Clearly very little has been accomplished. Well, one hopes that there's been a lot of technical agreements on details of citizens' rights and so forth. But in terms of the overall politics of it, we're still discussing... Well, part of the problem has been for 3 years we've carried on with the referendum debate. Put it bluntly, we've had a lot of bad losers. It was very striking on the evening of the referendum itself. Nigel Farage said that if it was a big vote for Remain, he would give up his campaigning. If it was a narrow vote for Remain, he would press for another referendum. At which point, various politicians, most eloquently Paddy Ashdown, came out and said how outrageous that was, and that this is a one-off decision, that it must be honoured. When the people have decided, they have given their orders, we must obey them. Very ironic coming from a Liberal Democrat, given that his party was at the forefront of campaigns for a second referendum. I think there's been a sustained effort to cast doubt on the first referendum. Instantly, the narrative from a large section of the media, and of course from the Remain campaigners, was to try to argue that the referendum had been about something other than that which it had been about. The story was that this was a campaign against economic austerity. It was people who had been suffering because of cuts in public spending registering their protest. Or else it was an anti-London vote. It's the forgotten provinces. It is the way in which our economy has suffered from a north-south divide, and it was the north protesting against this. Or else the story was one of, use the great buzzword of populism. And of course, once we had President Trump elected, was it 4 or 5 months later, those who were trying to discredit the referendum were instantly drawing a connection between the two and saying it was the same phenomenon. I really don't think it was the same phenomenon at all. And as to this idea that it was somehow populist, well, in a way, yes. If the elite in a society generally, in this case, was supporting Remain, and you oppose Remain and support Leave, well, it is going to be, in a sense, a populist rebellion against.
Well, surely any referendum is a vote for populism, is it not? It's what is the popular opinion?
Yes, indeed. That is the other big aspect of this question, in fact, and which is why it is so dangerous that people have been trying to undermine that referendum's validity and suggest we must have a second, or indeed that Parliament must overrule it. That this really does imperil our whole system of government, the whole principle of representative government. That, in this country we have a system wherein Parliament is sovereign. The ultimate decision-making power rests with Parliament, on the assumption that Parliament represents the people. In reality, of course, there's always been some gulf between parliamentary opinion and public opinion, but the essential idea of it is that the MPs who represent their views. By its own will, by its own volition, Parliament chose to have this referendum. It's not a compulsory part of our constitution. They gave the decision to the people. The people then decided. If Parliament then shows that its own decision runs contrary to the will of the people, the idea that Parliament represents the people is gravely damaged, and people will never look upon Parliament with the same respect, perhaps is too strong a word, but acceptance of Parliament as being their Parliament representing them, possibly not for decades afterwards. And a political system which has worked really exceptionally well by international standards will be severely weakened, and people will then be aware what we, the people, think is something quite different from what Parliament thinks, citing the example of EU membership, and their sense of the validity of the laws that Parliament makes will be permanently diminished. Why should we care what 650 MPs in Westminster think? They don't think the same way as we do, will be the attitude.
And they don't listen to us if we voted for something and they don't. Okay. So you don't think that, I suppose all referendum are straightforward. First, the side with the most wins, even if it's only 10, 15, 20.
Well, but, I mean, that's generally been the assumption. Again, I recall, I think Paddy Ashdown told us, if it was 1%, nevertheless, that will be final. Of course, he said that thinking that Remain had won. Yes. But I think that's the only... I don't think we can effectively have a system whereby in the decisions that flow from a referendum you have to reflect the percentages voting on either side. It's not the case that when we elect a government, we think that they have to take on, 45% of the opposition's policies because 45% voted for the opposition party.
Yeah, so it's simple in-out, and that's what we voted on, and that's what should...
I think, yes, that's the other aspect of this question. When I say that people are trying to devalue the referendum, there was a way... The other approach was to say that people didn't know what they were voting about. And this line, people didn't vote to make themselves poorer. Well, it seems to be given that I said, that, as I said earlier, the Remain side based its entire campaign, unwisely, I think from their own point of view even, on the argument that leaving the EU will damage our economy, and they trotted out the Governor of the Bank of England, the head of the IMF, and various investment bankers to come out with this line. Their whole case for remaining was the economic damage that they believed or said would occur if we even voted to come out, let alone actually leave. Then for them to turn around and not when I say voted to come out of the single market and the customs union, and how this would disrupt our trade, to then say that when people voted leave, they were voting to leave the EU and not voting to leave the single market and the customs union, seems to be a direct contradiction of the whole economic case put forward by the Remain campaign, which rested very much on the perceived or anticipated economic damage of leaving those economic aspects of the EU.
Now, this interview has been recorded on the 2nd of April, so we're very much in, well...
Limbo?
Limbo, in that I was going to say the final stages. Well, we don't know. So what's your view of, we've had the first stage tranche of vouchers, but I think there was 7 options, and they were all voted down.
8, wasn't it?
Yes. 8 originally. Yeah, yesterday we had 4, all voted down. Now, what's your view on that? Why, admittedly, one of them last night was only lost by 3 or 4 votes, I think. Very close. What's your view of why everyone is voting down every proposal? Or why each proposal is being voted down by a majority?
I must say I was quite relieved to see that the last 4 were voted down, as all of them were attempts to avoid giving force to the referendum decision. Beyond that, if one takes into account Mrs May's so-called deal, although given that it's not ratified and doesn't seem to have stand much chance of being ratified, to call it a deal seems premature. That's a different story. I think part of the problem there was our having a Prime Minister who had not been on the Leave side and didn't really understand the outlook of Leave voters. I was very surprised when her deal was unveiled, and I heard some Leavers saying how dreadful this so-called Irish backstop arrangement was, because I really at first didn't believe that Theresa May, after the statement she had made earlier in her speeches on her objectives, could possibly have signed up to such a deal. Perhaps that was naive. Perhaps her biggest mistake was to accept the whole idea of negotiating a withdrawal agreement separately from a negotiation of our future relationship. Particularly the idea of trying to negotiate on the issue of the Irish frontier without having a clear idea of what the economic relationship between the territories on either side of that frontier would be, was just a futile endeavour. So I think she did make very serious tactical errors very early on in the process.
Is Theresa May a good leader?
I think given the state she's in, it would be impossible to say she's been a good leader. On the other hand, one has to have some sympathy and say that she was in a very difficult position. I don't think she should have found herself in so difficult a position, because I think that members of Parliament should have been more willing to respect the result of the referendum. Given that so many of them were not, including people of some significance in her own party, I have to agree that she was facing a very serious problem, and her efforts at party unity, I think, have rebounded. In trying to please everyone, she's pleased no one, really, which was perhaps predictable. But maybe she would have been better off if she had made a very clear Leave stance at the beginning, as she seemed to, it must be said, in her speeches, but that didn't carry through into her negotiating position with the EU. And if she had taken a strong line at the beginning, it would have been rather harder, perhaps, for the Remainers to speak out against it. Though, given their, I suppose you have to say, courage found later on, maybe it would always have ended up in this way. And we have to bear in mind that her biggest mistake of all, of course, was either calling an election or else fighting such a dismal election campaign that, far from strengthening her hand, she desperately weakened it. Although it's very hard to know, given that her own views are so unfathomable, even if she had won a great election victory, how she would have used that victory, who knows? She may have used the leeway it gave her to turn against the Remain minority in the party and ignore them, or she may have used it to ignore the hardline Leavers.
Now, before this interview, I agreed not to ask you what would happen next, so let me ask you, what's going to happen next?
given that Parliament, I don't think, is going to come up with any very clear line of policy, and even if it does, I'm not sure. If they're not prepared to vote down the government, it seems to me they have to accept the line the government takes. I don't think Parliament can conduct an international negotiation by itself. That said, maybe they will vote down the government. On the other hand, it's very difficult to see a clear line coming from the Cabinet when the Cabinet seems so desperately divided, as divided as Parliament. That means that a great deal of decision-making power rests with the Prime Minister herself, and as I said in response to a previous question, none of us really know what Mrs May thinks about this issue at all. She became Prime Minister because she had never made clear where she stood, and therefore seemed an acceptable Prime Minister to both Leavers and Remainers. Given all three sources of authority are so uncertain, it would be very unwise to make any bold prediction. Rather than make a prediction, I would rather make a plea and just emphasise that respect for our political system by the citizens of this country is at stake. If MPs go ahead and overturn the referendum result, and I take the view that holding a second referendum amounts to the same thing. It certainly amounts to an attempt at the same thing, because the whole reason for holding a second referendum is to, in the eyes of most of those who recommend it, to overturn the result of the first. They will do very lasting damage to our political culture. And to imagine that a second referendum will be in any way conclusive is a great mistake, when it would be a second referendum called at the behest of people who do not believe in the conclusiveness of referendums.
The EU think we're a laughingstock. Does it matter how they view us?
Yes, they do view us as a laughingstock, and with reason, I think. If we show that we do have the courage of the convictions of the democratic majority, I think they will ultimately take us more seriously. As it is, ever since the referendum, I'm sure they've been pinning their hopes on Remainers in Parliament to overturn it. I mean, the EU's response to every referendum that's not gone its way, those held in Ireland, Netherlands, even France, has always been to delay, to try to get a second referendum and to overturn the first. I mean, or indeed just to go ahead by stealth in the case of the European Constitution, which even when France, a traditionally pro-integrationist country, rejected that constitution in a referendum, they just put the constitution into a treaty, said it's not a constitution, it's a treaty, and went to. I must say, I think that was the decisive moment when I felt this is an organisation which has no respect for the views of the people it governs. I think if we show them that, although it seems hard to say given the state of opinion in Parliament, we do take seriously the view of ordinary voters in this country, it will perhaps unsettle them and if we do break away, and make them perhaps rather more responsive to the views of the citizens in the 27 who remain. Because I've always felt that we should be setting an example to the EU and sending the EU the message that blithely charging ahead in placing more and more responsibilities on the shoulders of authorities, the Commission, the Council of Ministers, the European Parliament, which don't really carry public confidence, is a bad thing for them as well as us. I hope that we will eventually make our message plain, and I think some of them might have the sense to listen to it.
My last question is one that I hope will provide a fairly succinct answer. Can you give me 3 words to describe the way that Brexit has unfolded?
Misrepresentation after the referendum. That said, some misrepresentation went on during it as well. Dare I say betrayal? We haven't quite got to that stage yet, but I would use it of some, certainly. Unwisdom, perhaps, would be the third. And I don't mean in terms of the decision, but in the conduct of those who, having asked the people to decide, having assured them that their decision would be respected, having emphasised that this was a once-in-a-generation vote. I saw a very fine clip of Peter Mandelson promising that, quote, with every fibre of sincerity in my being, then to go back and try to overturn it, is deeply unwise in the sense that it will destroy any lingering belief in the legitimacy of our political institutions that remains.
Oh, thank you very much for talking.